Welcome back to Honoring the Journey, my friends. I'm so glad you're here today for Keith Giles. Could not get enough of him when he was here on Monday. So I actually was like, you know what? Can you come back and talk about the new book that you have about Mary, the Quantum Gospel of Mary? And I
Mm.
believe it's Mary Magdalene, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, because I think some people are like, okay, wait, are we talking about the mother of Jesus? Did
Which
she
Mary?
write something?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I'm so excited, guys, because I've been doing just a little bit of research. And if I'm honest, like I'm hoping that this will be a good template for people who would read a book called The Quantum Theories for Dummies. Because like I
Yeah,
completely have like brain freezes when I think about like I'm like, it
yeah,
doesn't make sense. I can't think about it. But
yeah,
Keith, I'm gonna do everything I can to pull out of you in layman's terms
yeah.
like
Okay.
why this is so important, why you wrote this book, and how can this serve as a stepping stone toward like a more expansive, maybe even mystical spirituality. So let's go.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. I'm
Yay.
so ready.
I'm so excited. Okay, first of all, why this book? Why do you think this is such an important book right now?
Wow. Well, I mean, this is the second one in a series, so I think the previous book I did in this series was the Quantum Sayings of Jesus from the Lost Gospel of Thomas. And so I think this Gospel of Mary is important and significant um, book for our time for the same reasons that I felt like Thomas was, because it is sort of this quantum gospel message, which we'll get into in a bit. Like, what does that mean? But I mean, I say this all the time, and I feel like it sounds um, it sounds like it's over the top or something. But I don't think I'm overstressing it to say that I really think this is the answer to everything. When I
Oh
look at
wow.
the way the world is today, we're so divided, right? There's so much division on every possible level. This idea of us versus them. I mean, we see it in politics, we see it in religion, we see it between the nations, where there's wars, there's genocides, there's all kinds of division going on between men and women, even between families, you know, uh, parents and children, really at every possible level. And there seems to even be um, almost an industry behind it where like people benefit, right? Political systems, religious systems,
Mhm.
social systems, even our social media benefits from this division. And so they're constantly stoking it, right?
Yeah.
Those people over there, they're the problem. If we could just, all of your problems are their fault. Oh, those people over there, right?
We're right. You're wrong. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm right and you're wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
And and keeping us divided, this is what leads to genocide and war and poverty and all kinds of horrible things. And the message in Thomas and the message of Jesus from Thomas, the message of Jesus and Mary in the Gospel of Mary provides a solution to that, like to help us kind of break that spell uh, that people seem to want to put us under, that focus all the time on our differences and our separateness. Um, what Jesus is saying to us in these Gospels is that that's an illusion, that
Mm.
we're not separate at all. And it really does align a lot with what we're seeing in quantum physics when it comes to this, the idea of quantum science, what we see from that, which I think is so astounding to me. Like, here are these
Okay, you need to
10,000 years ago, right?
I love you. I love you, Keith. You know that. But I
Uh,
am on such a low level of understanding when it comes to this word quantum that this is why I'm so excited because
okay, good. Let's
I
do it.
think you're a good person to explain this because I'm assuming maybe I'm maybe I'm crazy, but I'm assuming there's a lot of people like me who are like, okay, what is
Oh, yeah.
this? Why wasn't it in the original scriptural canon?
Yeah.
Why do you think and then why is it a big deal now? And isn't it
Yeah.
kind of weird that it's not in the quote Bible?
Yeah.
These are
And,
all, and what does
yeah.
quantum even freaking mean? Because every time I try to understand it, my mind just stops
Yeah.
like a brick wall.
Oh, yeah. Well, so let's start with the quantum, and
Uh,
then we'll
we'll
shift
move
over
in. Yeah.
into why Thomas and Mary and some of these other gospels were not included in the canon. Um, well, I'll start off by saying, like, if you don't understand quantum, you're probably you're being honest, because even honestly, most quantum physicists will admit that they don't understand it completely. In fact, there's a very famous quote. Robert Feynman was one of the preeminent quantum physicists, said, if you think you understand quantum physics, you don't. That no one really totally does. In other words, there are things that they can observe. So they can do, we do scientific experiments and we can see the results. We see the behavior. We don't understand how. We don't understand why. But we cannot deny over and over and over again in these experiments, this is indeed what the result is. And so that shift, that big, like, what the hell is going on here, is what's driving us into moving us away from what's called Newtonian physics and into quantum physics, which is a very different assumption. So I'll try to explain basically, right? Prior to quantum mechanics and quantum physics, scientists largely were materialists. That's Newtonian physics, is very much like reality is basically what we can measure, right? And what we can absorb through our senses, what we see and taste and feel and touch, right? That's what's real. That's reality. That's the universe.
That's science.
And yeah, that's science, right? And that immediately created this tension between science and materialism, and mystics and theologians and philosophers. Right, when it comes to
we can't see, but we know.
Right, exactly. What about the human soul? Science can't measure that. There's no atoms of the human soul. We can't take a sample of that and do an experiment with the human soul. So but it's real.
Right.
So, that's part of reality. And so that was constantly the challenge, is philosophers, theologians, mystics pushing back on science. Again, this is prior to quantum physics, and saying, okay, scientists, if this is true, what you're saying is that the only thing that's real are atoms and molecules and things we can measure, then please explain how consciousness arises out of matter, right? How does consciousness come out of matter? And why is it only in humans, really, like this human consciousness? Why is it in humans and not in carrots or giraffes or trees? You know what I mean? And of course, scientists have no answer for that. Historically, they were like, we don't know. So
you got to love the honesty.
Yes, I do, at least. Look, yes, thank you. Instead of coming up with a bullshit answer, I admitted we don't know. We don't know. Okay. So there was this. So they did this. What's the famous? That's called the double slit experiment. That happened a long time ago. Actually, I think it's early 1900s or late 1800s. It's a really long time ago when these first experiments were done. But then they've continued to repeat them because we get better and better equipment and technology. So they've repeated them over and over again, and they get the same results. The double slit experiment initially was very simply just to determine what is the nature of light. Because scientists would say, some scientists argued light is a wave. There are light waves, right? Or others would argue that light is a particle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they did this experiment where they made in a dark room, they have this strip, and then they have two slits in the strip. And on the other side of the strip and the slits, they have a photosensitive sort of paper, right, or wall. And so in the dark room, they would fire like a single photon at the strip. And the theory was, okay, if light is essentially a wave, then the pattern we get on the other side of that strip will make a wave pattern. Like if it was water and there were waves of water, when they passed through those two slits, they'd make an interference pattern on the other side. And they could see what would happen with water. And like, okay, so if light is a wave also, like water, then we'll get a similar pattern on the back wall. But if essentially light is a particle, then the particle will have to choose one or the other of the slits. It's not going to go through both slits, right? Because a wave would go through both of them. Okay, that's probably the easiest way to explain it, right?
Yeah.
A wave would be a solid thing that would go through both slits and then create the pattern on the other side. But if it's a particle, it's going to pick one or the other slot to go through, and then there'll be a different pattern on the other side. Okay, here's where it gets crazy.
Oh boy.
They did the experiment, and they kind of just set it up and left the room, and came back a couple hours later, and sure enough, the pattern on the other side was a wave pattern. Like, there it is. It's a wave. Light is a wave.
Let's
Okay,
write it
so
down. Let's make it real.
we did it. Here, here comes the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Science Prize. We're gonna win the prize. But then they ran it again because science. You want to make sure is it repeatable.
Yeah.
So they ran it again. This time they observed it. They observed the thing in process. But because they were observing the experiment, now the pattern on the back wall looked like particles. And what they noticed was, if they observed it, it behaved like a particle. If they didn't observe, it behaved like a wave.
Okay. Whoa.
Yes, that's where it got weird.
What does that mean?
Well, okay, they didn't know.
Huh.
First of all, it didn't answer the question: is light a wave or a particle? It actually created another question, which was,
Why is it
does light know if we're watching, and does it behave differently? And here's what that suggests: that light has consciousness.
Oh my word.
Yes, this is why it changes everything. Okay. Now, they've gone on to do other experiments. In fact, there's a really amazing video on YouTube where they did this recently. Because again, there's all these theories about why that happens, right? Well, maybe you're
Right.
interfering with it somehow, right? And so they set up these like crazy, elaborate experiments where they would fire a photon at a prism that would split the particle into two particles, and one particle would be measured and would be observed, and the other particle would not be. And then if they observed one particle, the other particle, which was not observed, would behave as if it had been. And now they said, oh, somehow these particles are entangled. Like one of them knows what is happening to its twin and is behaving in whatever way the twin was reacting. Now, like, it just got worse. Like, okay, now we're not answering the question. We're making even more questions. How does the other particle know?
Keith, wait.
Yeah,
Can I pause?
Yeah.
Pause. Okay, my sweet little brain that wouldn't even know what class would even teach this in. You know what I mean? I'm like, is this
Physics.
biology? Is it
Physics.
physics? Yeah, I've never in my life taken a physics class. So, and it's starting to make sense why, because my brain may not be able to handle it. But
Yeah.
Okay, so if light has a consciousness
Yeah.
and it's aware when we're watching it and when it's not, does this mean that it's ready for us to know that? Because why would it show itself as,
Yeah.
do you know what I mean? Like,
Oh,
it
no, I
would
know.
know that we were doing that, and it would,
Yeah.
it should have just made it consistent if it didn't want us
Yeah.
to know.
Yeah.
So there's a reason that light wants us to understand, hey guys,
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
here.
So let me make it even crazier for you. It
Cool.
isn't just light.
Okay.
They have duplicated this double slit experiment and gotten the same results with molecules, with atoms. I mean, it's not limited to light.
Mm.
Like there's just a long list of other experiments they've done using other kinds of particles, and it does the same thing. If you observe it, it behaves one way. So it knows that your consciousness is aware of what they're doing. And then it'll behave a different way if you're not observing it. Okay. So one of the experiments that they did, again, these super elaborate experiments to try to understand what's going on. When they did the one with the prism where they split it, one of them, what they did was this is a different experiment. I'm sorry. But this was also kind of crazy. So they did the double slit experiment, but they put the sensor that was observing it on the other side of the slit. Okay. And sometimes they would turn it on, and then sometimes they would not be turned on. And if they turned it on after it had gone through the slit, meaning now it's being observed, it would change. It would almost like go back in time. Like it would, because it has to decide if it's going to be a wave or a particle before it goes through, right? It's going to go through as a particle or it's going to go through as a wave. And the sensor isn't on yet. But if you waited till it made the decision, and then after it's already decided what it's going to be, am I going to be a wave or am I going to be a particle? And then you turned on the sensor, it would behave as if the sensor was turned on before it went through, as if it knew you were going to do something you hadn't done yet.
Because you're part of The
You're connected.
consciousness. Oh,
Yeah, exactly. It's so insane, Leslie.
I just
This
got
is just
chills literally from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet. That is insane. This is
so.
so cool.
So let's just wrap this up, okay?
Okay, yeah, yeah.
So I talked about earlier that the Newtonian physics, the materialist view prior to quantum physics, the challenge mystics and theologians and philosophers had to scientists who materialists was, if everything is atoms and molecules, how do you explain consciousness? And the answer scientists had was, we don't know. Now that we have quantum physics and all the stuff I just explained to you, right?
Yeah.
Now what quantum physicists are saying, there's a guy named Sir James Jean, a very famous quantum physicist, in Nature, the journal Nature, which is probably one of the biggest journals in science. He said in an article about quantum physics, he said, we can no longer think of the universe as a great machine, meaning materialism. He goes, we must now think of the universe in terms of a great thought or consciousness. And so essentially what quantum physicists are saying now is, you guys were asking us the wrong question. You were asking, how does consciousness arise from matter? And the real question should be, how does matter arise from consciousness?
Mhm.
That the universe is consciousness, that everything has a form of consciousness. Okay. So ultimately, what quantum science is saying now is that everything is the quantum field, and the quantum field is everything. In other words, everything seems to be separate. That's how we perceive the world, right? You're you, I'm me. This is my microphone. This is my cup, right? These are separate things. But at the quantum level, they're not separate things. Everything is one thing. Everything is an expression of one thing, which is the quantum field. And the quantum field is sort of this consciousness that pervades the universe and inhabits everything.
Okay, wait.
Now,
Pause.
okay.
This sounds, okay, I'm putting on my evangelical hat for a second
Yes.
because I know I may still have one or two people who listen who
Oh,
are
yeah.
very evangelical, just out of curiosity. And by the way, I love you very much. Thank you for sticking around. But this sounds very new age, Keith.
Kind of.
This is kind of scary to evangelical Leslie. Like,
Mm.
it's not scary to deconstructed Leslie. Like, I'm like, "Ooh, this is so cool," just because I'm not afraid anymore. But if
Yeah.
I was afraid to believe
Yeah.
something that may go against what I'd been taught, this would be very new age sounding to me. So,
Okay.
but this
Yeah.
isn't new. This
No, it's
is
not.
and so this is interesting because the gospels that were chosen to be in the Bible,
Yeah.
don't really, do they talk about this?
Well, in a way they do. And that's what I think is interesting. It's like, so, yeah, I've written these books talking about how I see it in Thomas and I see it in the Gospel of Mary and some other books. But it's not like, again, it's only in these sort of lost gospels. This is the way Paul talks, actually. So for your evangelical listeners, 2 or 3 of them who are still out there, thank you for hanging in. Look, I get it, actually. And in fact, I do this in the books that I'm writing because I feel the exact same thing. I'll write some of these things and I know I can hear my evangelical friends going, wait a minute, this sounds a little scary. So I want to always stop and go, well, wait a minute. I know it sounds, when I say it that way, right? Everything is the quantum field and the quantum field is everything, right? But what if I instead, like, instead of saying quantum field, what if I said Christ?
The
What if
Christ
I,
consciousness, or
yeah, well, what if we even just go, not even just Christ consciousness, because that still sounds new agey.
you're right. You're right.
Let's just go to let's go to Colossians
Okay.
or Ephesians, right? Where Paul says, we are all filled with the fullness of Christ who fills everything in every way. Or Christ is all and is in all, right? Or everything was made by him, for him, and through him, right?
Yeah.
Or Christ is Paul says, Christ is the one in whom we all live and move and have our being. That language is all through the New Testament. So this is
You're
not
right.
a crazy idea. It's just, you sort of change the terminology, right? What the scientists are calling the quantum field, a theologian or an evangelical could say, oh, that's that's the same idea of Christ, right?
The Spirit of Christ. Yeah.
Yeah, fills everything in every way. Fills all of us, right? And
Yeah,
we're all in the image of Christ and all that.
but only if you ask him into your heart.
Well, yes, then that's the part that
That's
takes
the part that's a
a
little
little bit of nuance. But I wrestled with that for the longest time
Me too.
personally, and until like someone finally showed me the verse which I just quoted, the one where Paul says, that we are filled with the fullness of Christ, who fills everything in every way. And there's also, it says that Christ is all and is in all. But what really kind of did it for me of like this, well, no, Christ is only in Christians, is like, well, then explain how Paul could say that Christ fills everything in every way, not in some ways, not certain people in certain ways, but others in different ways, or not at all. No, I mean, Christ fills everything in every way. That means Christ is in everyone and in everything, right? So
Okay.
I think if you're going
So
to be
that's
true to
quantum.
Scripture,
I love you just did that in 20 minutes.
there you
Like
go.
I understand quantum theory. I understand, at least from a
At least
very,
how it
very
applies to this. Yes.
yes, exactly. And that is a really big deal, Keith. You're a good teacher. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I had to understand it myself first, right? And it's
Oh
not
yeah.
easy.
Have you
Um,
always been into this kind of stuff? Is this something that happened after deconstructing?
it kind of happened after deconstruction. Yeah. After I wrote that 7-part Jesus on book series, that's when I wrote Sola Mysterium, which initially was just about embracing the mystery and saying, like, we don't know, and God's a mystery, and, and that's okay. We don't have to have certainty. But in researching that book, I started looking into the quantum stuff. And yeah, that's when I started finding out some of the stuff, and it was blowing my mind. And then I couldn't help, because I'm reading these books that are either about quantum science by quantum physicists, or I'm reading books that are looking at the mystical side of things. And then I'm suddenly connecting the dots between those two things and saying, this sounds like what Jesus says. This sounds like what Paul says.
Mm.
Like, so that was really exciting. And around the same time, I started looking into the Gospel of Thomas. And then it all clicked. And I was like, oh, whoa, this is very, very interesting. So,
Well, let's talk about this Gospel of Thomas and then also the one of Mary. And
yeah.
I know there's probably more.
Oh, there's a couple more. Yeah.
Are these did they call them Gnostics? Is this the Gnostic books? So,
Some
and
people,
that's a
yeah.
scary word. That's a scary word
Oh, yeah.
for a lot of people. So I think
Yes.
that's definitely misunderstood.
Yes.
But why were they left out, do you think? I know you probably don't know the answer, but you can probably give an educated hypothesis, I would assume,
Right.
of like why this might be left out and
Yeah.
where they were, when did they discover them? And have people been saying this all along, but they didn't have language for it because they hadn't done these experiments yet?
I think so. Yeah. It's what I find really fascinating is like this kind of stuff we're talking about oneness and connection, but with God and the universe and one another and all that. This idea that separation is an illusion and all that. I mean, yes, we definitely see that in the Gospels of Thomas and Mary. As I said, we see it in some of the New Testament texts as well. But I mean, it's all very similar to what other mystics have been saying in other, Hindu and Buddhism and Black Elk, Native American mystic, and which is it's really interesting to me. It's almost like there are things that we sort of spiritually could know intuitively that only now is science confirming that some of the stuff is true. But let's get to the question of like, these texts and why they weren't included and all that stuff. I will say quickly, Thomas and Mary are not Gnostic texts. People always say that, and typically
Yeah.
it's very pejorative because it does sound like, oh, Gnosticism, that's a heresy, and even Paul was against that. And I would say yes, Gnosticism is sort of a very wonky, weird, pseudo Christian belief system that talks about like there's a demiurge, demigods, these a hierarchy of angelic and godlike beings, that the God that created us and planet Earth and our solar system isn't the true God, but some other lesser God that was created by the true God. But that God that created us and planet Earth is sort of an idiot and doesn't know that he's not the most supreme God. And Jesus came to tell us that his father is not that God, but is this other God who's the supreme God. Like, that's not, and that's not even the wonkiest thing about Gnosticism. Actually, it gets even weirder.
Wow. And this was I mean, like, don't they talk about this in the
That's
Bible?
in first century, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say they've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time.
Right, right,
And that
exactly.
does sound wonky. You're
It
right.
is.
That's
It's
crazy.
super wonky, and there's the good news. Thomas doesn't mention anything of that stuff. Gospel of
Good.
Mary doesn't mention any of that stuff.
Okay.
So what really helped me, I didn't know the answer to that question about like why, like is it Gnostic or not, or why it wasn't included, or why these texts were suppressed by the early church, until I read Dr. Elaine Pagels. Elaine Pagels is phenomenal. She has a couple of books. but one is called Beyond Belief, which is an excellent book about the early church and the development of early Christianities, plural.
Now, can
Because
you tell me what her name is again?
Pagels, Pagels, Elaine Pagels. And the book is called Beyond Belief. And oh my
Okay.
gosh, is it amazing.
I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes for you.
Yeah, please do. It's super. It's a great, great book. And so what she talks about in that book, and I did not know this until I read that book. It's funny because I studied a lot of early church history, but I'd always only read what we would call the proto-Orthodox, like Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, Justin Martyr, what we call the church fathers. And you get the idea, if that's all you read, then you get the idea that early Christianity, first, second, third century Christians, all kind of believe the same things, and there was only one Christianity. And Elaine Pagels points out that there's so much evidence that there were a plurality of Christianities, that there were various different, probably 20, 30 different sects and groups of people around that time that would have all called themselves followers of Jesus, would have all said, I'm a Christian, but had slightly different views of who Jesus was and what his teachings were and how to follow him and what that looked like. So of course, the dominant one, the one that survived, right, to today, was what we now call the Orthodox Church, which are those church fathers, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, all those guys. But there was another fairly large and sort of prominent early group of Christians around the same time they were the Valentinian Christians. They were the followers of a guy named Valentinus. And we know from reading Tertullian and Irenaeus and the people that opposed those guys, they're the ones who tell us about Valentinus. And what they tell us is Valentinus was the disciple of a guy named Theodos. And Theodos was discipled by this guy named Paul the Apostle. Oh, so isn't that interesting? Yes, directly, Valentinus.
So wait, the MVP?
Yeah.
The MVP of the New Testament is kind of one of the... Okay.
Yes. And Valentinian Christians taught this kind of stuff we're talking about, that there was no separation, that we all have this shared oneness with Christ and with one another and humanity. And it's not just their teachings, by the way, it's also their practices. So Irenaeus talks a lot about, he was one of the first early church fathers who really was the most vocally anti-Valentinianism and Valentinus. And one of the things he hated about them, he talked about, was the fact that in their services and when they gathered to worship, that these horrible people allowed women to baptize people. They allowed children to read the scriptures. They allowed people that weren't ordained or bishops, to speak about Christ and share their testimonies. Horrible, like awful people. Why don't you just let the men do everything? The ordained bishops and all these, the correct people. So I think that's really interesting, because when I was reading that, the stuff that Irenaeus was saying about the Valentinians and why he hated them so much, I'm like, dude, if I lived back there, I'd be going to a Valentinian church.
Yeah, me too.
I would be going to your church, dude. So anyway, what
live and let live. Yeah.
Yeah. What Elaine Pagels points out in her book is that there was this early tension between the Valentinians and what we call the proto-Orthodox, right? Irenaeus and all those guys. And we see this happening for a couple of hundred years. There's this back and forth. And so Valentinian Christians, their ideas and their thoughts kind of even work their way into some of the sermons of Tertullian and John Chrysostom and some of these other early, even the Orthodox Christians, like, were open to some of these ideas. But yet there was constant, no, this us and them, we don't like those guys and blah, blah, blah. And by the way, the Valentinians really favored things like the Gospel of Thomas and his other Gospel of Truth, some of these other texts.
So they had these texts back then.
Yes,
they had access.
Yes, they did. They all did, right? Because even Tertullian and some of these other guys quote from Thomas and other texts. I mean, I mentioned this in my book, The Quantum Sayings of Jesus, about the Gospel of Thomas. The Apostle Paul quotes from Thomas in 2 Corinthians. Like, it's what? So anyway, so here's why they didn't end up in the Bibles that we have today. This tension between these two factions continued all the way up until the time of Constantine. Constantine, puts together the Council of Nicaea. He only calls certain bishops to sit on that council, and he gives them the authority of Rome. And so after the Council of Nicaea, this doesn't happen at the council, but it happens after the council, because now they have this authority on them. Athanasius was one of the church fathers on that council. And now, under the authority of Rome, he writes a letter to all the churches, all the Christian churches. And it's called the Easter letter. And he tells them in the Easter letter, he tells all these bishops, all these seminaries, all these churches and student schools and things like this, theological schools, that they can no longer use the following list of texts in their services and in their teachings. And on that list were texts like Thomas and the Gospel of Truth and all these, again, these texts that were favored by the Valentinians.
Why?
Well, because it was sort of the way of finally shutting these guys up. Like, we have the power now. We want to win the battle. Like, we're the Christians now. They're not. Right. And so this is their authority to say once and for all, we're
The
right and
illusion
you're
of
wrong.
separation. The
Yes.
illusion. Yeah.
And so we think this is because around the same time is when somebody in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, at a seminary there or a monastery there, took 30 something of those texts, the same ones on the list of Athanasius' list, and instead of burning them and shredding them, stuck them in a jar, sealed it, and buried it in the sand, and it was discovered and dug up right in the 1950s. So that's a pretty good argument for, we know that there's a tension between these two groups. We know Athanasius writes a letter, and we know that around that same time, someone buried a bunch of these things in the sand, and then they got discovered. And if they had not been discovered, we wouldn't have copies of them. So
Wow.
that's the reason why they didn't end up in our Bibles.
Is this okay? Okay. I was always under the assumption it was the Catholic Church that put the canon together. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, they did.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the official canon came after that.
Right.
But
But they're the ones who said
suppression,
these are
yeah,
out.
the suppression of those texts came before that. The Athanasius Easter letter is pretty much the beginning of, we're not doing this anymore. Don't read from these texts, don't teach from these texts anymore. And they had these weird ideas, like Irenaeus had this really stupid explanation as for why there could only be 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because there's 4 directions on the compass and there's 4 corners to a square. It's like, that's so dumb. What? Why?
Well, I think
Why are there
it's
12
narrow.
gospels?
It's like a narrow way of thinking that.
Yeah.
Honestly, it totally tracks with religion.
It doesn't.
It wants to have certainty and answers, and it's sad that you have to like silence other voices in order to
Right.
make your point, because that to me tells me it's a very wobbly
Yeah.
way of looking at the world. Like, if you want to see how expansive and beautiful and different, and some people aren't ready for teachings about quantum theory. They're just not ready. And
Right.
I know, I mean, I would have been like, this is crazy stuff like 10 years ago. But, I'm kind of to a place where I'm ready. And I feel like we should have access to these. So let's
Yeah.
talk about Mary Magdalene for a second, because I've always adored her. I have always adored her, but I also kind of pitied her because I was like, oh, she was just a whore. And, Jesus took her in. I was told these things. I was taught that this is all she was, and that she just followed Jesus around and probably had a crush on him. You know what I mean? But
Right.
I know now that there's so much more to her. So give us a better idea of who Mary really was.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I think a lot of people have the wrong idea about Mary. And first of all, I should just clear it up. She was not a prostitute. That was something that I think in the 11th century or something like that, like really late. Some Catholic Pope had a sermon where he said that, and it's pretty much stuck ever since. But no, Mary was not a prostitute.
I heard that, and I was so excited. I was like, I know it.
Yeah. And you know what? I this book that I wrote, The Quantum Gospel of Mary, I could not have done it without. I mean, thank you, Elaine Pagels, all the stuff that she helped with. But even more so was Dr. Elizabeth Pulser, or Elizabeth Schrader Pulser. Elizabeth Schrader is really, I think, the preeminent. She is the best scholar when it comes to the Gospel of Mary. She's done incredible research, and she sent me things that she hadn't even published yet. She was super helpful in writing this book. So thank you, Elizabeth Schrader, for helping me with this. And one of the amazing things that Elizabeth Schrader Pulser discovered, which has now actually been approved by both Protestant and Catholic Bible societies, So the future study Bibles that are published will include her research and her notations about the fact that she has proven now that there was an effort made um, by early church Christians, early scholars, to literally erase Mary Magdalene in her prominence from the Gospels.
They did a great job.
And they did a fantastic job. And so the fact that we can see, like, why were they so threatened, right? Well, first of all, she's a woman. Second of all, if you look at the things that they tried to erase and tried to edit, they're removing the idea that Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of John is the one who makes this Christological proclamation that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. They don't want Mary to say that, because Mary in the Gospel of John is also the one who is at the tomb, at the crucifixion, when all the other disciples have run away.
Yeah.
She's at the tomb at the resurrection, and she's sent out. That's what the word apostle means. Jesus sends her out as an apostle to the apostles to proclaim to them that he is risen from the dead. And so if you have a woman who is an apostle to the apostles, who has made the same Christological statement that Peter makes, right, in the other Gospels, and when Peter makes the same Christological statement, it's when Jesus says, you are the rock, and Peter, and upon you I will build my church, right? So Peter becomes the rock because he says it. And
Mary gets erased.
Mary gets erased. That's right.
Wow.
And here's the fascinating thing about even the name Mary Magdalene. Because in one of the Gospels, I think maybe it is John, it says, they say Mary of Magdala, as if, she's from a town called Magdalene or Magdala. Here's the deal. There is no ancient city called Magdala. In fact, the only town called Magdala in the Middle East currently is one that they changed their name, I think, in the 7th century to Magdala to match, to sort of like, oh, we'll be Magdala. And they just changed their name to fit what the gospel said. But prior to that, to this day, there is no historical evidence there was any town called Magdala. So what they think is going on is that was another, whether intentional or not, a mistake. That it's not Mary of Magdala, it's Mary of the Migdala, Mary Magdala, because Migdala means the tower. In other words, there was a title given to Mary as someone like Peter. Peter is the rock, and Mary is the tower. And by the way, we have other early church fathers prior to this editing that took place to attempt to erase Mary, who flat out say in their notations, when they quote that section, they say it's Mary who says it. And they also say that Mary was the tower. So it's very interesting to see that there was an attempt to erase Mary. Mary was a threat. And so we see also in the Gospel of Mary, in the Gospel of Thomas, in the Gospel of Philip, and also in Pistis Sophia, these are 4 non-canonical texts, right? All 4 of those texts give us examples of this argument, this tension between specifically Peter and Mary Magdalene. And it's always coming from Peter, right? He doesn't like her. He wants Jesus to shut her up. How can such wisdom be in a woman? All these kind of things. So again, we have historical evidence that there was a tension between sort of Peter and the followers of Peter, and Mary Magdalene and her followers as well. So this tension continued to the point where they just decided, let's just take her out. Let's erase her. Let's minimize her.
Just so familiar. I'm so familiar. Golly, okay.
Who would do such a thing, right?
I can't imagine a group of people not wanting to listen to women.
Yeah,
It's so weird.
Yeah, I'm so glad we've grown and matured.
Yes, we have definitely evolved
We would
past
never
all
do
that.
that. We would never do that.
Guys, we're being facetious. You know that.
Yes, of course. So yeah, I mean, so that's that's what you can see. And so in the book, I again, thank you, Elizabeth Schrader-Pulser. I quoted a lot of her research demonstrating these things. And what's funny is she discovered it initially in the oldest copy of the Gospel of John that we have. That's where she first saw it. She can literally see where the scribe had gone in and erased the name Mary and put in Martha. And there's in the original version, it's just all the verbs, all the tenses are singular. There's only Mary there. and then they all get changed to plural when they add in Martha. So it's a very obvious, someone went in and edited this on purpose to add in Martha, because then if Martha says it, it's not Mary. And if by adding Martha to the story, it forces you to assume, oh, this must be Mary and Martha from the Gospel of Luke. Yeah, but otherwise they're not in the Gospel of John, right? You kind of borrow them and put them in there. So yeah, I mean, it tells us that yes, that Mary was a threat. They didn't like what Mary stood for, and they certainly would not have listened to anything called the Gospel of Mary, written by a woman.
So what did she stand for? What did they hate about it? Like what was her big message underlying?
Yeah. Well, the Gospel of Mary has a couple of pretty big messages. I should say, first of all, sadly, what we have is a fragment. We don't have the entire text. I'm still hoping one day we find a complete text. So we're missing the first, I think, 6 pages. So it's sort of what we have starts like on page 7, kind of in the middle of it. So we don't know how it began. And then in the middle, and this really feels not accidental, that someone literally cut out like another 6 or 7 pages in the middle of it, because the second cut in the middle comes right at the part where Peter says to Mary, we know that the master spent time with you alone. Share with us the things that he taught you when we weren't there. And Mary says, yes, Peter, I will tell you. Here's what the master said. Jesus said to me.
And then it's gone.
And then it's cut. And then it picks up pretty much as it's wrapping up, like says like, oh, and therefore, blah, blah, blah. Like, so that seems very intentional.
That sounds suspicious.
Yeah. So, but even then, even though we're missing a huge, very important chunk out of the middle of Mary and the part in the beginning, what we are left with is still pretty powerful stuff. And I would say, I guess, one of the most important things is when Jesus says to Mary, okay, let me see, let me just find it, because I think if I quote it, it'll be more interesting. This is a big deal, and I really love this part of it. So this is what would be page 9 or chapter 9 in the Gospel of Mary. It says, when the Blessed One, and this is Jesus, when the Blessed One had said these things, he blessed them all, saying, peace be with you. Bear my peace within yourselves. Beware that no one leads you astray, saying, look over here or look over there. For the child of humanity is within you. Follow it. Those who seek will find it. Go then and proclaim the good news of the age. Do not lay down any rules beyond what I determined for you, nor give a law like the lawgiver, which would be Moses, lest you be confined by it. And when he had said these things, he departed. So the heart of it is that idea of this idea that the child of humanity is within you and to follow it. The fascinating thing is that phrase, child of humanity, is another way of using a very similar term that we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which is the term son of man, which is a messianic title, right? The son of, or child of humanity. And the way son of man is used in the other gospels, we tend to read it as, oh, this is only about Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
These things about Christ, and, it's only about Jesus. And so therefore Jesus should be worshiped and elevated and all this kind of stuff. But, oh no, we're wretches and worms, and we can never, ever be like Christ, which, by the way, even the other gospels don't support that idea either.
Yeah.
But that's our theology kind of has pushed it in that direction. So in the Gospel of Mary, when Jesus uses the phrase and says the child of humanity, which again echoes this idea of the Son of Man, but then he says it's in you, right? It's the Son of Man / child of humanity is in you. It's not something it's only in Christ. It's in you because Christ is in you, right?
And it didn't sound like he was saying, if you do this, he was just saying
it is in you. Yes.
Yeah.
It's just in you. And he's also, and then later on in Mary, this idea of the humanity. In other words, it's not saying, in a way, what it's doing is saying that to be human isn't to be lesser. That actually to be fully human is to be fully divine, because the divine, and in other words, Christ has been incarnated and in the flesh and in all of humanity. So because God has made us human, because the child of humanity, and again, that has a connotation of this Christ-likeness, is in all of us, we are connected to, we are fully human and fully divine, right? It's in everyone. That's a pretty core idea in the Gospel of Mary, and that gets expressed in very different ways, after that.
So that would be very heretical to somebody
To
in a
some
more
people,
separation, sort of penal substitutionary atonement kind of
yeah,
theology.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But again, I don't think these are heretical ideas. Like I
I
think
don't either, but I
that
think,
idea
yeah.
that the child of humanity is within you. I mean, it's no different than when Jesus says, "I'm the vine and you are the branches." And you can do nothing apart from me. In other words, the Christ that's in you and in me, like we are connected. Like you can't tell where the vine ends and the branch begins. There's this oneness and connection. Jesus says, "You'll do greater things than me." Well, that could, in some context, that can sound heretical, but Jesus says it. Jesus is the one saying it, right? Jesus says,
Huh.
at one point, he says, "I'm the light of the world." But then later on in the Gospels, he says to the
Mhm.
disciples, "You are the light of the world."
Right. Yeah.
Paul is constantly doing this in his text or in his epistles. He'll say something that's true of Christ, and then he'll say, because it's true of Christ, it's true of you, right? Because Christ has died, you have died. Because
Mhm.
Christ is crucified, you've been crucified. Because Christ has been risen, you have been raised with him. Because Christ is seated at the right hand of the Father, you are seated at the right hand of the Father. Not that you will be, you are.
You are.
So
Mhm.
everything that's true of Christ is true of you. So
That's
it's
so, that's like, I get this. And I have actually come, and I'm curious what you think, um, kind of where I've landed. And I don't know if I'll stay here, but this is where I've landed right now. And I love it. I kind of feel like when we talk about sin, I feel like sin is when we don't believe that
yeah,
we're connected,
yes,
because then we act out of desperation and we
yeah,
act out of fear and we act out of, I need to do this and in order to, and Jesus is like, no, like, so when people say Jesus died for our sin,
yeah,
I think, yeah, kind of, but like not in the way that you think. Like he
right.
died because of our sin.
Because we're sinning,
Yeah.
actually. Yes.
And I believe our sin, is that we didn't believe that he,
Yeah. No,
his
exactly.
message and like,
Yeah.
but his message is so misinterpreted. Like
Yeah.
to me, when I read the Bible now, like I read it through a different lens and it,
Yes.
it says exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
But I was not taught that way, that that's
No.
what the Bible meant. And to me, it's just so fascinating that the very same Bible that firmly planted me in evangelical teaching
Yeah.
also firmly plants me in more of a Christian mysticism,
Yeah.
like, we are one teaching.
Yeah.
And so people are like, we don't believe in the Bible. I'm like, no, I don't necessarily believe in the way I was taught
That's
that the
right. And I'm
Bible.
reading it a different way now through a different
Yeah.
lens that I never had before. But now I
And
can see it.
yeah, it's so crazy to me,
Yeah.
it,
It is amazing. And what's funny, it's interesting you said that about sin because one of the very first things in that Jesus says in the Gospel of Mary, Peter asks Jesus, what is sin? And Jesus' answer is there is no sin. There's
mm,
sin is only what you have made it.
mhm,
Um, And I think I agree with that. I mean, I realized even before I think, or while I was deconstructing, when I was still sort of quasi, evangelical Christian,
mm,
it used to always bother me. Like we have such an emphasis on sin, right? And yet it seems like with Jesus, Jesus is forgiving sins all the time, right? He doesn't even ask you your name. He's like, your sins are forgiven. Okay, now what do you want? Like it's just automatic. Jesus is constantly forgiving sins.
What
Paul
about the
says,
time he said, "Go sin no more"? What about that?
well, again, I think it's this idea that sin, this concept of sin is something that we're the ones that dwell on,
We're
right?
doing it, yeah.
But to say go and sin no more is like, that's not even your focus. That shouldn't even be what you're hung up about,
Mm,
right?
interesting.
Like Paul says in 2 Corinthians, and this again, I never heard a sermon on this verse growing up in church. But Paul says in 2 Corinthians, that God was in Christ, not counting our sins against us,
Yeah.
but reconciling the world to himself.
Mm,
Holy moly. Okay. So God is not counting anyone's sins against them. Paul also says in 1 Corinthians 13, God, love keeps no record of wrongs, right? And God is love.
mhm,
God is not the one keeping the score. We are, right?
mm,
We're the ones who hung up on the sins. And so that's what I think Jesus is saying there. Like, stop focusing on the sin. Like, I remember when I used to go to church, it used to bother me. Like, I noticed the pattern, right? The services would begin every Sunday. We sing these songs. Oh, what a worm, what a wretch. I don't deserve anything, blah, blah, blah. And
I'm
then
the
at the end,
worst.
Yeah, it's so horrible. Then you get a sermon about Jesus, and then you go forward and take communion, and okay, good. Oh, forgiveness feels so good. I'm accepted now. I'm loved. Ah, everything's right between me and God. But come back next week and we'll do it again. We'll just go around this merry-go-round, this revolving door every week. And my thought was, why don't you start the service where you normally end it? Why don't we walk in at the beginning and say, God was in
Remind
Christ?
ourselves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
God was in Christ, not counting our sins against us. God has reconciled the world to himself. It's done. It's finished. Hallelujah. Let's start celebrating the fact that God is not counting our sins against us, right?
But why
We're the
do
ones
we
dwelling on the
why
sin.
do we do that, Keith?
It's religion. Religion
Well,
has to create these these hoops for us to jump through to gain something we already have,
right.
right? You've already got that. You're loved already. You're forgiven already. You're accepted already. Christ is in you already, right? So you don't have to do anything to get that. It's already there, right? It's not like, oh, but I don't deserve it. The sky doesn't deserve to be blue. It's just blue because it's the sky.
Because it is.
Yeah, it's because it is. You're just loved because you are, right? You're forgiven because you are. And stop dwelling on this
Does
nonsense. I'm
that
like, do I deserve
scare
it?
us?
I'm a sinner.
Does this just scare us to think
Yeah.
that we don't have to do anything? Like, are we really just human doings and not human beings? Are we
I think,
really that like scared to
yeah.
trust? I mean, it really does feel like when you fall back and your friends catch you, it's like,
Yeah.
are
The
we
trust one.
afraid there's not going to be anybody there to catch us?
Right. Right.
I was
It's
scared.
so funny. Yeah. It's like we're more afraid that God is really better than we think God is. Why? Instead of that God is something to be afraid of, it's so weird.
Oh,
It,
this
it is
message
weird.
is beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. And it resonates. Like I can't even tell you what it my spirit feels when I hear this. And
Yeah.
I know it's not about like I was always taught it's not about feelings.
Right.
If you're feeling your feelings are liars, your emotions
Yes.
are liars, you can't trust your heart. But
Yeah.
but when I stopped not trusting my heart and when I stopped ignoring my feelings is
Mhm.
when I started to understand
Mhm.
this a whole lot deeper.
Yeah.
And when I started to understand really the only and if you really think about it, when you don't believe that you are connected to God, you have this fear of abandonment. You have this fear of separation. You have unknown. I don't feel loved. And what do we do when we have all of those emotions? We do bad things.
Yeah.
We do bad things out of desperation and fear and hate. Somebody
Yeah.
look at me, So in a way that makes sense that, if we will do wrong things when we
Yeah.
don't believe it, because when you believe it and you walk in that truth, it's like
Yeah.
Jesus said, you can do even greater things than I can.
That's right.
Like, and that's that oneness. And he even talked about that. Was it John 17? Like,
Yes.
all about oneness. How
Yeah.
did we miss that in church? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I think that's super powerful. Yeah. There's
yeah,
a verse where Jesus says to the disciples, um, in that day you will know. In other words, like you don't get this right now. You don't understand this now, but one day you're gonna get it. You're gonna realize this and go, oh wow, it's gonna blow your mind. And what he says is like in that day you will know, I am in the Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. And again, we've made that all about Jesus. It's only about Jesus.
yeah,
But I think Jesus is saying to the disciples, no, you individually are going to
part of
have
it.
the same realization. You're going to say to yourself, I'm in the Father. And now you're in me and I'm in you. Like so we're connected to God and we're connected to one another. Of course you are, right? You can't be connected to God and not be connected to one another if everyone's connected to God in this way, right? And then this goes back to this quantum idea, right?
Yeah.
That the quantum field is everything and everything is a quantum field where Christ is in all and all is, and Christ is all and is in all. We're all connected, right, to the divine. So we have a shared divinity and a shared humanity. And that's why I say it's the answer to everything, because I think if we can really get this and embrace this idea, this is how we love our neighbor as ourselves, because I don't see my neighbor as another person. I see Christ in them. It's how I love my enemies, right? Because I don't see an enemy. I see myself reflected. I see Christ reflected in that other person, right? This is how the end of poverty, because I don't see that guy over there who's hungry and begging. Like, no, I see myself, and I have compassion and empathy for this person. So I think if we could get it, if we understand the things that are being said in Thomas and in the Gospel of Mary, and in these other texts, like I think it really would help us sort of awaken and wake up to this reality, because that filter will change the way we live,
Yeah.
right?
It has
We
changed
tr
me
Yeah,
100%.
yeah,
I literally have no fear of death now. I
yeah,
have no fear of hell. I have an absolute every day I wake up feeling unconditionally loved,
that's
and I
beautiful.
never had that. I never had it,
Yeah,
Keith. All I had was anxiety and depression because I
right,
was so afraid, and even if I were, like, for sure, like, I know I said the prayer right, even though they always told me to question it. It's like, well, you know what? Yeah, sometimes you just don't really mean it.
yeah,
And it's like, well, dang, how do I know if I meant it? I think I meant it,
yeah,
And it's just that ridiculous carousel of like fear and
yeah,
doubt and all of that. And the minute I just let go of that and just said, I'm just going to trust you. I'm just
yeah,
going to trust that you love me right
yep,
where I'm at, that you're not so insecure that you need me to say a prayer that I believe in you so that you
mhm,
can continue to be my God.
right,
Like, that is just such an insecure,
yep,
like, admit it. I'm your father. It's like,
right, right,
stop it. Like, it doesn't change that he's
yeah,
our father.
right.
The thing that changes is us when we think he's not.
That's right. Yeah. And that's what Paul even says, that we were separated from God in our minds, not in God's mind, right? Because God knows, yeah, you're mine. You belong to me, right? We're the ones who need to have that shift. So,
And
yeah,
that's a
it is beautiful.
religion thing. It is. It is.
Yeah.
You're right. Well, thank you, Keith. This is like so rich. I love this conversation. It's probably one of those ones I'm gonna have to listen to a couple of times, but just to really wrap my brain around it. But I love it and I appreciate you. I can't wait to get your books and just, expand a little bit more. That somebody asked me the word that explains my life right now the other day, and I was like,
Yeah.
expansive. I just
Yeah.
feel like my world is expanding. I didn't even realize how tight in this little tiny bubble that I was until I really started exploring and trying to understand spirituality on a deeper level. It's been
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah.
And you've
It
been a
is.
huge part of that. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. Yeah. It is. It's wonderful. Yeah. I agree. I feel the same way. I have a lot more freedom and joy and hope now. And it's also changed the way I relate to other people. Like, I relate to people as other human beings. I'm not
That have
hung up
something
on.
to give,
Yeah.
that they're not just deceived
Yeah.
and you gotta save them.
Right. Right. I can learn from them, and they can, we can have a wonderful relationship, and I can listen to them and grow. And
I
yeah,
don't
it's
have to
beautiful.
change you, you don't have to change in order for me to love
Yeah.
you more. I mean, it is the freedom I believe that Jesus died to give us. Like,
Yeah.
it is for freedom that Christ has set you free, and I
Exactly.
feel that now, like, I really do. So,
Yeah.
I appreciate that you're stepping out there and you're talking about this stuff that seems really scary, but you're making it a lot easier to understand.
I hope so. I hope
I
so.
appreciate that,
Yeah.
and I'll
Thank you.
put all the links, guys, in the show notes so that you can get this book and also his one about, the quantum sayings of Jesus with,
Yeah.
from the Gospel of Thomas. I appreciate your work, Keith, and I really do wish you much success. Thank you for
Thank
being
you.
here today.
Thank you, Leslie.